I think most of you know that I recently returned from a wonderful 3 month sabbatical in Europe. And I put that out there because I know that there's a few people that are visiting for the first time, and I just want to give you a little bit of background. My theme was beauty, art, and spirituality. And I had the opportunity to go to some places and see some of the most famous and amazing art in the world. I went to the Louvre in Paris. I also went to l'Orangerie, where I got to see some of Monet's giant paintings of the lilies. I went to the Picasso Museum in Barcelona. I think about the great art I got to see, and I just feel so blessed and humbled both as a human being and as an artist, to be so inspired. And I was by all this great and famous art. But I also want you to know that I visited a lot of places that were more out of the way, where there was art that was maybe unexpected to see altogether, but basically the art that most people don't even know about. And every time I went somewhere, I felt a sense of connection. And I want to begin by telling you a few stories of the art that I saw, and I'm going to begin with the oldest art. In the caves of Lascaux, which were about 2 hours directly to the east of where I stayed in France, there is art there that is almost 20,000 years old. This art was done at the end of the last ice age. It's about as old as art gets as far as we know at this point. And I just want to tell you, it was amazing. As I walked through this cave, which is actually a reproduction of these other caves that were basically just a few yards away, I walked through a tunnel of art. And it was an exact replication of the original caves. And so all over the walls and the ceiling were these ancient cave drawings. Now think about what we didn't have 20,000 years ago. We basically didn't have anything that we had today, but somehow these amazing artists painted all over these walls and on the ceilings pictures of animals in many colors and symbols. And I took the tour through the Lascaux cave. It was called Lascaux number 4. And I felt so amazingly connected. And I remember holding on to that because as I started my sabbatical, I wrote a vision down of what I wanted to have happen, what I wanted at the end of the 3 months to look back and say, that's what happened. And I wanted to pay attention to all the art and ask how it might be speaking to me. Well, as I was walking through Lascaux number 4, I just felt connected to these people from almost 20,000 years ago. And I know nothing about them. In fact, the experts know virtually nothing about them except that they painted those pictures. I thought, gosh, here are some people I know absolutely nothing about, and there's a sense of connection through their art. The other thing I noticed is as I was walking through, there were some other people with me going, wow, amazing, awesome, oh my God. You could hear these little gaps of words as we were going through this, and people were just feeling connected somehow to this art. But I want you to know that I felt connected with all the people that I was with as we were going through these caves, saying, oh my gosh, awesome, incredible, together. And that's what art does. I think, anyway. The other art that came to my mind this week happens to be architecture. And I want you to know I saw amazing architecture, I saw famous architecture, but the thing that moved me the most was architecture on the island of Sardinia in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea that I knew nothing about before I got there. So I'm staying with my friend Andrea, and we've been friends for somewhere between 30 and 40 years when he was an exchange student in California where I grew up. And we've kept in touch all these years, and this is my second trip to go see him and his family on the island of Sardinia. And one day he had to go to work, and he said, Alan, just take my car. You need to go see the Nuraghe. And I had to say, what's a Nuraghe? Because that's just something that we're not taught over here in Hawaii or in the United States. And he said, there's these, the Nuraghe are these ancient buildings that the oldest ones are about 4,000 years old. And he said there's thousands of them, the ruins anyway. And actually, I looked it up, and there's 7,000 nuraghe on this island, all over the island. And they're as old as Stonehenge, or almost that old. Almost as old as the pyramids of Egypt. And I remember the very first time I got out of the car, I could see it out in the distance, and you pay a little bit of money at this little gift shop, and then you walk on a trail, and I thought, no, I'm not too impressed. It just looks like a, but my friend said it's worth it. You got to go see. Well, as I walked a little closer, I was a little more impressed, but what took my breath away was walking through the entryway, and it reminded me of those cartoon pictures, or the cartoons we saw as kids, where somebody would run up to a tent, and the tent would be like half the size of this table, and you would walk into the tent, and voila, it was the size of the whole sanctuary here. Well, I walked inside of the nuraghe, and there's this massive entryway, and I thought, wait a minute. I had to go outside and come back and look in. I thought, there's room for that in here? And then there were 4 doors that I remember, and 2 of them went into separate little rooms, and there may have been more than 4. The 2 I'm remembering was the 2 that went into these rooms, and as I walked into these rooms, I thought, this room feels bigger than the whole thing looks from the outside. And then the other 2 doors were entries to stairways. So they were stairwells, and one went up to another level, and I took that up, and it's massive. It's like you just can walk around. You can almost have a dance party up there. I was blown away. Then I came all the way back down, and I thought, well, there's another stairway. I'm going to go up there and see where that goes. It went to the very top, and you could see for miles and miles around. Now, imagine 7,000 plus of these all over this island. I did a little research on this, and I also found, just like in the ancient cave drawings, the experts know very little about these people. They don't know why these perfectly round structural buildings made out of rocks were made just that way. They don't know a lot about what these people's lives were like, except that obviously they were connected because there's these buildings all over this huge island. And that's about it. They knew they were great designers, engineers, architects, artists. But again, I thought, I know virtually nothing about these people, and because I've been in their space, I felt connected to them. And I was there on a day where I think I was the only one that spoke English. And I could hear all these other people, mainly in Italian and other European languages, saying things that I think were, wow, awesome, oh my God. I mean, it was just amazing. And even though I didn't speak their language, I felt connected to all of the people I was there, as well as the people that lived 4,000 years ago that built that thing. This week, as I was looking at our reading from the Gospel of John, John chapter 17, and the prayer that Jesus had for his disciples and the disciples to come afterwards, I kept thinking about the art and the architecture and all the great things I saw while I was in Europe. And I said to myself, you know, I think we would be better at fulfilling that prayer if there was more art in our lives. Because Jesus said that they may all be one. 4 verses that we read in John 17, 4 times Jesus said those exact same words. Now, that doesn't happen very often in the Gospels. So for Jesus to say something 4 times in 4 verses in the same chapter, not that he was thinking chapters and verses as he spoke, but for us to look at that saying Jesus said this over and over and over and over. And here's something else that caught my attention. This is the one place that I can think of in all of the Gospels where Jesus prayed for us specifically. Now, there's a lot of places where Jesus will say a prayer, and it sounds like, oh, it's for the disciples or for all people. But Jesus specifically said, as he was praying this prayer to God, I'm not only praying for these people, in other words, the disciples that are right here, but all the people that will come to believe, but because of them. In other words, this is the one time Jesus that we know of specifically prays for all of us. And what does he pray? That they may all be one. As I was reflecting this week on those words and reflecting on all the art that I saw, it occurred to me that I felt more connected to other people that I knew nothing about, that were completely different than me, that had a completely different religion than me, different culture, probably different skin color, than I did probably the whole time I was growing up in the church. And I thought, somehow we need more art in our lives, one way or another. Now, I'm thinking in the Gospel of John, as Jesus said that, just a little bit of the umbrella picture of what's going on here. Chapters 12 through 17 is Jesus preparing the disciples for his departure. And I mentioned this last week a little bit, but I want you to know that this is the prayer that Jesus has for all of the people that will follow him after he's gone, that they all be one. And as I was looking at a little bit of history this week, and as I was reflecting on things I saw in Europe, I kept thinking over and over and over and over and over again, we have not done a great job as the church in the last 2,000 years of fulfilling that prayer that Jesus had for us. One of the things that I read this week was by a man called M.D. Aletheia, who wrote a book in 1897. And M.D. Aletheia was his pseudonym. In other words, it wasn't his real name. But he wrote a book and basically said that there were something like 56 million deaths because of the church, or on behalf of the church in Christian countries, or because of Christian countries, from the 4th century until his lifetime. And I thought, that's a lot. I wonder where he got all those numbers. But what he did in this book is he listed every conflict that he was aware of and how many people that he thought or had some evidence for who actually died in those conflicts. And so some of it was Christians killing Christians over theology. Some of it was Christians killing Muslims over theology and land. Some of it was Christians killing Native Americans in North America, the indigenous people of North America and South America, for the church. And he went on, and I thought, 56 million people. Let's say that he was off a little, or even a lot. I don't care what the number is. We have not done a great job as a church over the last 2,000 years, fulfilling the prayer that we might all be one. And I want to tell you that Jesus never meant that we might all be alike, that we might all look alike, or love alike, or sound alike. The unity that Jesus talked about was complete and open acceptance of people as they are, for who they are, without any judgment. Just loving one another and agreeing that we have disagreements, so be it. The first mention, at least in the book that I read from M.D. Aletheia, had to do with the Arian controversy in the 4th century. And if you don't know anything about 4th century politics or history, that's okay. It was a long time ago. But Arius was a leading theologian in the Christian church, very respected. Thousands and thousands of people loved him for his work and his ministry. And he taught what later came to be known as Arianism, that Jesus was like God. Now that sounds reasonable, but the word he used for that in the Greek at the day, which is what he wrote and spoke, was homoiousios. And that just means, in English, in like nature, similar. Well, Athanasius, who was another leading theologian, said, it's not homoiousios, it's homoousios. Now, homoousios means like nature or similar in nature. Homoousios means the same nature. So anyway, the emperor, the first Christian emperor, Constantine, gathered these two together with a bunch of other bishops so they could make a decision on who's right and who's wrong. I mean, he couldn't live with the fact that Christians might disagree on something. So anyway, they had these arguments in the Council of Nicaea that went on and on and on. And finally, it was determined with the emperor's blessing that Athanasius was right and Arius was wrong. And the only difference between those two words, homoousios and homoiousios, was the letter I. And because of that I, according to MD Aletheia, 1 million people died after that. And I thought, why didn't they teach us this in seminary? Why don't we all know this about our church history? So my thought, though, was, oh my gosh, this is what happens when we try to get everybody to look like everybody else and to agree on everything, rather than saying, it's okay if you see God through different eyes than I see God. It's okay if Christians understand God through different eyes than a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu might. And that doesn't take away anything from our own belief or our own commitment to Christ. Richard Rohr, who I've mentioned several times, who is a modern day author, theologian, and mystic, says this about art. All genuine art is sacred. And he's the one that wrote the book, The Divine Dance, about the Trinity. And if you were here last year during June, I had a picture of the Trinity, and there were these three figures and a little square down below. And the square, many art historians believe, was a mirror. And so you're looking at the three persons of the Trinity and yourself, because they're constantly inviting us in to their presence. Richard Rohr talks in his book about art being the thing, and especially icons or iconography, which is the art of the Eastern Orthodox Church, like Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. Iconography is not so that people will look at the picture, but so that they'll look through the picture, so that they'll have eyes to see beyond and see how we are a part of something so much bigger, and we are all connected here together. And I believe that not just iconography, but all art does that. It connects us, sometimes even better than the words, the great theological words that we have as well. So there's another author I wanted to share, just a quote that I read this week. And it's a quote I've seen before, and I thought one of these days I got to remember this for a sermon. So I wrote it down, and this is actually William Paul Young, and some of you might know him from the book The Shack and the movie The Shack, just kind of different ways of understanding and describing God. But before I read the quote, I just wanted to say that he distinguishes between art and pornography. And then he says that pornography is like bad theology. And here's what he says. I love this quote. Bad theology is like pornography, the imagination of a relationship without the risk of one. It tends to be transactional and propositional rather than relational and mysterious. It dehumanizes God and turns wonder and messy mystery of intimate relationship into a centerfold to be used and discarded. I have to tell you, that's one of my favorite quotes about theology that I've read in a long time. In fact, let me read it again. I really want this to sink in. Bad theology is like pornography, the imagination of a relationship without the risk of one. It tends to be transactional and propositional rather than relational and mysterious. It dehumanizes God and turns the wonder and messy mystery of intimate relationship into a centerfold to be used and discarded. Now, I just want to tell you right from the start, I'm not terribly fond of phrases like bad theology, or when people say that's bad theology and here's good theology, because it tends to make people say things like, well, this is what I believe, so this must be good theology, and that's what you believe, so it must be bad theology. And that, I think, sometimes causes a lot of the conflicts between us. I tend to go with the phrase transformative theology versus static theology. And let me explain that to you. Static theology is when we have a box, and we create this perfect idea of God in our heads. It's just the God that we want. And we've got it all figured out. And it's a beautiful picture of God. And we have made it. We would never admit that we have made it, but we have actually made that picture of God, that image of God, and that's what we worship. And that doesn't change anything at all. It certainly doesn't change us. But transformational theology is blowing God out of that box, saying, we will never totally understand God. God is such a great mystery, and as much as God reveals God's self to us through the scriptures and through the many ways of experience and relationships that we can know God, we will never know all of God. And because of our openness to however God might show up in our midst, we are open to change as individuals, in our relationships, as a church, as a nation, as a world. Transformational theology is a place from which you stand as if you're looking at really good art and changing the way you see because of it. And that thing that changes us more than anything else for the better is God's love. The fact that each and every human being, including me, including you, are created in God's image, as different as we might be. And you know, we're perfect the way we are. And it's okay that we look different and think different and maybe have different theologies. And some of us might say homoousios and some of us might say homoiousios. It doesn't matter. Now, you might label me as a heretic for saying that because Arius was labeled a heretic and kicked out of the church for that one letter. And I think that was one of the worst decisions the Christian church has ever made. And I know where I stand on all of that, theologically speaking, but it certainly wasn't worth a million deaths. The one letter I. I think we need to get away from that I and say we, us, and how can we make this world a better place all the time together. So I want to close by telling you the piece of art, which was actually many pieces, that I saw that had the greatest emotional response to me of all the art I saw in the 3 months that I was in Europe. It was my last day in Geneva, and I really wanted to go to Geneva to see John Calvin's church and the Reformation Museum and the great, huge statues of the great reformers of the church and on and on. But anyway, it was my last day, and it had been pouring all night long. There was a horrible storm, and luckily, most of the time I was there, it was beautiful weather, but the night before, it was just this awful storm. The next morning, the rain had somewhat subsided, but the wind was blowing like crazy over Lake Geneva, and it was biting cold, and you could hardly stand up. I mean, it was just this violent wind, and I remember thinking, you know what? I still want to go out for a walk today, even if I can't go out for a long time. And I got on this little tiny boat. They have these little shuttle boats across Lake Geneva. And, you know, this boat's kind of like all over because the water is just, you know, not cooperating. And that didn't bother me. So I got to where I wanted to start my walk. And I was just walking along Lake Geneva, and I was walking past these giant billboard type things. I mean, they were just these huge photographs. And I wasn't paying much attention because I mainly didn't want to blow over. I was just kind of watching, you know, where I was stepping, and there weren't too many other people out. There were just us crazy ones. But anyway, I was wearing my rain jacket with my hood over it, and I noticed that I had tears in my eyes. And I just all of a sudden thought, wait a minute, I'm emotional about something. What's going on here? And it occurred to me, without it even being fully conscious, all of these pictures that I was walking past were pictures of refugees from Africa that decided to get on these tiny little rafts, many of them with their children and their toddlers and their infants, because whatever lay beyond the Mediterranean Sea, the great unknown, they were convinced was better than where it was that they lived. And I had to stop and just stare at some of these pictures. I think the first one I saw was a picture of somebody holding up a baby. And it just occurred to me, these are little, tiny infants and toddlers on these boats. Their parents are risking their lives. And I thought, my God, how bad must life be? How dangerous it must be for them to risk their babies and their children's lives. And to get on a boat with them. And as I walked through the whole exhibit, it was about a quarter of a mile long. I mean, every 10 or maybe 15 feet, there was another one of these great billboards with a picture of refugees on it and the boats. And I walked to the very end, looking at every picture, and then I walked back because they were two-sided. I looked at every single picture. And I think I had tears in my eyes the whole time. And then at the very end, or actually it was the beginning, but I had walked all the way back to where it started, there was an explanation of the exhibit. And it was pictures from the SOS Mediterranean, which is a European organization that helps save refugees that are floating out in the Mediterranean Sea. And this organization, they have these boats, and they go and they basically save people. And it said on the very opening sign, in the last 4 years alone, 20,000 people that we know of have drowned. And our conscience does not allow us just to let that happen. We know that we've got to do something, and we know that we've got to tell the world, this isn't just a problem. These are lives. These are babies. These are infants and toddlers and teenagers. And the only reason they're in this position is because getting on that little raft and heading out without an engine into the Mediterranean is safer than where they're coming from. And I'll tell you, I've been reading about immigration and refugees for years now, and I hear it on the news, I listen on NPR, but there was something about that art that just got to me, like none of the words ever have. And I thought, I need to do something. I need to talk about this in church for starters. Also, I want you to know that I have some Facebook friends who think very different from me politically. Maybe some of you have some people like that in your life. And I am compelled now, much more than I was before, as graciously as possible, to tell people when they say hateful things, they're spreading hate around. And I'm going to invite them to think a little more carefully about what they say about refugees and immigrants until they at least meet some of them, or at least look at some of the pictures I've looked at. My invitation to you is that you will look for art in many forms and consider what art might be a part of your life that will help you connect with God, with the people around you, and whatever else is out there that's maybe missing from your lives. And I want you to know that painting, which I happen to do, is just one of many, many, many forms of art. And I've said this before, but every one of you is an artist in some way. You are creating something with your life. Think about what that is and how you might embrace that more fully, and also how you might embrace the art of everybody else around you. And to be grateful that we are connected and that we can, together and will, make a difference and make this world a better place. Amen.